Oh, I probably won't.
Bring you back in an hour. But
Yeah. Well, hi, I'm Erin. If you don't know me already, I've gone here since I was 2. I am one of the kids ministry interns this year. Yeah, shout out to Asa, the other one. um, so obviously I've gone here for a long time. Some of y'all know my story a little too well because I like to talk a lot and I like to talk about myself a lot. Uh, and some of y'all might not know any of what I'm about to share. So, yeah. So, before I get into it, I want to say stories have a ton of moving parts, and this is just some of the moving parts in my story, and they're still moving and they're still going. And also your testimony is not just the bad things that happen in your life, because I feel a lot of people think oh, that's what a testimony is. It's just somebody sharing all these bad things that happened in their life. But no, your testimony is what God has done through you and what God is teaching you through your life. So I just want to say that because I'm going to share some hard things. But so I was saved when I was 7 years old. I grew up in a Christian household. I had a very childlike faith. It was very sweet. It was very I loved the Lord. I loved coming to Sunday school. I loved coming here. So nothing much happened during my childhood. Starting in the 6th grade, I started having a lot of anxiety, and that all kind of stemmed from basically at the very beginning of my 6th grade year, my mom had this health scare. So basically, she had swallowed a pill, and it got stuck in her throat. And it burned sores in her throat, but basically her body just didn't react well to it. And she went to the doctor, and they thought she was having a heart attack. And at the time, the only thing I knew about heart attacks was that the old man dude from Anne of Green Gables died from one. That was the only thing I knew about what a heart attack was. So I was my mom is dying. And so that was a really not traumatic, but it was just kind of and obviously she ended up fine. It was just these pills that she had gotten stuck in her throat. But so that kind of started me being kind of an anxious person. And then I started having anxiety in everyday life, going to middle school. I had a lot of not friend drama, but just it's middle school. It's awkward and everybody kind of hates each other, and it's and I would just have this anxiety, and I was kind of known as oh, the friend that would worry about things or be oh my gosh, don't do that, and it got to the point where I would wake up super early, before I was supposed to wake up, and I would wake up and I would feel super nauseous, and I didn't know why, but it was because of my anxiety, and I wasn't giving my anxiety to God very well, and I didn't understand why God was letting me feel this way, and since it was the only serious thing in my life at the time, I almost idolized the fact that I had anxiety, and I almost built upon itself, because I was oh, that's the only serious thing that's redeemable in my life, I guess. And I had people around me going through really hard things, and I was oh, I need to cling to this hard thing in my life, and that's a super dangerous mindset to have. But yeah, so I would hyperfixate on that, and I would make it my entire personality. And that was just kind of all throughout middle school and high school, and then starting junior year, the middle of junior year, I got sick with this flu-like thing, and it was just a really bad virus thing, and they sent me to the ER because I was super dehydrated, and so they just said I had stacked viruses, which basically just means you have multiple viruses at once. I recovered from that fine, except I had a ton of sinus pressure after that, and so then they sent me to a nose doctor, and they scanned my whole head. They were so you have a severely deviated septum. So if you don't know what that is, it's it's like the bone inside your nose is like bent, or like it's like too big, so it like covers up one side of your nose, basically. So they were like, oh, you need to fix that because you're like not breathing right. So I went and had sinus surgery, and I think it's like an hereditary thing because like a lot of my family members have had this surgery before. So I kind of knew like, oh, this is gonna be like a rough recovery. So I was like nervous for it, but like I knew what to expect. So I had the surgery. The surgery went fine. Then about 4 hours after I got home from the surgery, my nose started like, it was like bleeding, like gushing out blood like for hours. And it was, to spare the details, it was just a lot of blood. So that was really scary. I was rushed back to the hospital. I was still on like a lot of medication because I had surgery 4 hours before. So I was very out of it. I was kind of like going in and out of like, I guess you could say I was going in and out of consciousness, or like going in and out of like being awake. Yeah, that's consciousness. Anyways, so I don't remember like a whole lot from that night, but I do like, I have a very like vivid memory of like kind of like having an encounter like with God. So basically like I was sitting there, this doctor was like sticking stuff up my like recently surgified nose. My dad was like literally like holding my head up because I was going in and out. I just remember being in like excruciating pain. I don't remember like if I actually did this, but I remember like screaming in pain. My mom's nodding yes, so I guess I did do that. Yeah, I really don't know what all I said and did that night, but I remember like screaming in pain, and I just remember like thinking to myself like, I could die from this, like if this keeps going on for hours. And like I wasn't like anywhere close to dying, but like I didn't know what was going on, so I thought like I could die. And like, you know, like if it had gone on for like a few more hours, like it would probably have been like even worse and even scarier. But I just remember like praying like a very like simple prayer of like desperation, basically saying like, I can't do this, I can't physically do this, I can't mentally do this, like you are the only one that can help me. Like, and like you hear about that like in the movies, like, oh, like I'm helpless, like I'm just gonna pray. But like I already knew God, but like I was just praying to him because I was like, this is the only thing that I have, because like I can't do anything for myself. And it was like a seemingly like insignificant prayer at the time, but it would turn into like a pretty constant prayer going forward for like the next year of my life. So they never figured out like why I bled out like that. And it took a few weeks for me to recover. But like I felt super like isolated during that recovery because obviously like we didn't know what happened to me. Nobody else I knew had this happen to them. Like, and half the people I knew like didn't even know that like that happened to me. They just knew that like I had surgery. So it was like a little bit like I would have to be like, no, like I had this traumatic event. But yeah, so I felt super isolated and just like felt like super down and like sick. And I got to be like I continued being like super duper anxious, and somewhat just like sad and like down. And so then in July of that year, I went to a camp called Summit. And on that camp, in the middle of like, it was like the second to last day or something, I was like, oh, like I feel kind of weird. And so I'm like sitting at my desk in this little thing, and my head falls over. Just my head. It just like plop on the desk for like a split second. And I was like, oh, that was like super weird. And like then my roommate come up and I was like, is this normal? Like I was like, is this what happens to people like when they feel weird? And she was like, no, like that's kind of weird. And and while we were talking, my head just kept falling. And it was like just my head, and it looked like I was like sleeping, like micro sleeps or something. So she like got really scared and she like ran and got the nurse at this camp that I was at, and the nurse was like, I have no idea what is going on. I ended up being rushed back to the hospital, which this time for whatever reason, it was like one of the most like terrifying times of my life, even though like relatively it was not as scary. But for whatever reason, like I just remember it being like so scared. It took like 30 minutes for the nurse to put the IV in me because I was so like I wouldn't let her do it, and I was like so scared. And they ran all types of tests. Everything came back negative. And they sent me home and they told me that I had anxiety. And I remember me and my mom kind of like breaking down in the hospital room after they're like, you have anxiety, go home. I was like, well, duh, I already knew I had anxiety, but most people I know with anxiety, this does not happen to. And at this point, like my head is still falling. It was super weird. And I just remember we were just like so like confused and scared of like what was happening to me. But eventually we went home, and I just remember like being like my body was hurting, my mind was hurting, like I didn't understand what was happening to me. And then at home, I went through months of like testing my head, testing my whatever, going to physical therapy, like all types of different stuff. And I wasn't allowed to drive for a long time because they weren't sure what was happening to me. So during that time, I was like embarrassed because how do you explain that to people? Like, oh, I can't go to this because my head is falling. Like, it just doesn't make sense. So I was like desperate for answers. I was desperate for healing. I was upset at myself. I was upset at the people around me because I wanted them to comfort me, but I didn't even know how I wanted to be comforted. And I felt like a burden to people. And I was just kind of isolated. I felt very isolated because I'd never even heard of anybody having this issue ever. And eventually, I was diagnosed with basically this thing that, like, basically my body just doesn't handle, like, stress well. So it was like my body was stuck in fight or flight mode. So it was like, but instead of, like, fighting or flighting, it was trying to freeze. So it was, like, essentially trying to pass out on me, but, like, I would never, like, actually pass out because I was, like, fully conscious. So that's really confusing in and of itself. But like after months more of appointments and whatever, like treatments, I got that under control. And I have not had that happen to me in a while now. But during that time, I was very like afraid of myself. I was afraid of my own body, of the future. I was afraid of my mind. And then, to top it all off, throughout this entire process, I had like continual like migraines, and since that incident, the first incident junior year, but we thought it was because of my sinus stuff, but then it wasn't. So they basically said like it's like a stress, like tension, like a migraine, but they said I had chronic migraine and chronic pain because of that. So I hadn't had like a moment without some form of pain for about a year straight. And I couldn't even remember like what not being in pain felt like. I remember people asking me, what's the first thing you're gonna do when you have a day without pain? And I was like, dog, I don't know. Like, I don't even know what that feels like. And it took a long time to get that under control, and that was like even more months of different things. But eventually we were able to like break that headache and get that under control. So now I've been doing much, much better, like worlds better. And so like with physical healing, eventually came like mental healing too. I was eventually able to process the fact that like what happened to me after my surgery, that it was like hard, that it was like a traumatic thing. And also just that like I was able to process like that happened to me, like, you know, and just kind of accept that fact. And then during a lot of this process, I was really close to someone who was really, really struggling with their mental health. This person was pretty suicidal, and I was constantly frightened. I tried to take their healing into my hands. I tried to fix it for them, but also for myself. And I didn't even realize I was doing this until after the fact. But I wrestled with God constantly over what God might allow to happen in their life, over what God could allow them to do to themselves. And eventually, me and this person drifted apart, but I was still so worried for their life and for their happiness that I lost sight of my own. And I was dealing with a lot, and so were they. And I felt so deeply alone during all of this because nobody ever talks about what it's like to be the person next to the person that wants to die. So I felt completely isolated. I felt like nobody else was in my boat and that I should be feeling sorry for them rather than trying to help myself in that situation, that I should be helping them. I was hurt by them. I was hurt by God. I was confused about God's goodness. And throughout all my health things, all of this going on, I landed in a place where I was just in a lot of doubt and a lot of confusion. And I tried to deal with it myself because I felt like it wasn't something I should share with anybody else. It wasn't that it was personal to them and I shouldn't share any of this. So I tried to not talk about it. And that ended up harming me. And eventually, after a while, I started opening up about more of the things that had happened. And I got help from different people and friends. And after a lot of wrestling with the Lord, I eventually found spiritual healing too. And I came to the conclusion that I am helpless without God, physically, mentally, emotionally. I don't have any control, and God has all of that control. I prayed those prayers of desperation, confusion, anger, countless times, but I knew I was completely lost without him. And I was trying to find, I kept I went to Epic, I went to all these different things in hopes of and just even coming here, I would try so hard to have a miraculous instance with God where he would just kind of snap his fingers and either fix it all or help me to know everything that had happened all at once. But then I kind of came to the conclusion that I wasn't seeking God himself, I was seeking answers for myself. And there's a big difference there because when you're seeking answers for yourself, you're not really looking at God, you're looking at yourself, and you're just thinking of your own things, and you're just why? But when you seek God himself, even though you might not understand, when you look at God, then you'll find more and more out about his character and his goodness and all that he's doing. And so I reached a point where I just wanted to hear directly from God, and I was I can't try to have a mountaintop experience by myself. So I just started in Genesis. I was I'm just gonna read through the whole Bible. I'm still only in Exodus, but because I've gone through it really slowly, but I've just tried to pay attention to everything that the Bible says about who God is, not who I am, but who God is. And that has been a big eye-opener just to see what he's doing and not what I'm doing. And so a big thing that I learned this year is God's holding me. He's never let me go. He's holding me in his hands, and his hands are big and his hands are good. And so his hands are holding me. His hands are holding all of y'all, and his hands are good. They're not going to crush you. They're not going to, like, flick you off. Like, like he's just holding you. But, like, but yeah, like, eventually the more that I saw, like, God and his character, the more he showed me, like, how he's been working, and not how, like, I've been feeling, but, like, how he's been working. And I was able to see, like, pockets of time where I was able to trust him and, like, what he was doing during that. And so, like, God invites us to give him our full selves. And so most of the time we think of this as just, like, oh, like, I gave Jesus my heart. But, like, no, like, he invites us to give him our full selves, like, full surrender of our physical bodies, which a lot of times people don't even think about that. Our, like, outside circumstances, we're invited to give him the people that we love and to give up our desire for somebody else's life for his desire for their life. And we're also called to give him our minds. So, like, full surrender brings full growth. And pain removed is less impressive than pain redeemed. I stole this from Matt, who stole it from some other guy. But basically, this has meant a lot to me because, obviously, I was in pain for a very, very long time. And I wrote this down in some random notebook from some random sermon, like, years ago. And I, like, found it in a notebook one day, and I was like, oh. And I've kind of held that as, like, an encouragement to myself during, like, being in all that pain. So, like, I wanted God to come, like, miraculously remove my pain, and he didn't, and so then I felt lost. But he redeemed it through teaching me things about him and about myself and about how I should walk with him. And now I get to share that in front of you guys. But yeah, so the more we seek God and his character, the more, like, we'll see his goodness in our lives, and then, like, the more we seek him, the more he'll give us his wisdom. And then we'll have that wisdom in mind for future trials, because trials will come. So I'm going to look at a passage, 1 Kings 19, verses 3 through 8, I think. Hold on. Stand by. Okay. So normally people look at this passage and they, like, talk about it in the sense of, like, oh, like, suicide. But, like, I just want to talk about it in the sense of just, like, full on just wanting to give up. And so, like, it might be that your physical body is giving up. It might be that your mind is giving up, whatever. But, like, when you feel incapable of fixing your circumstances and you just want to give up. So I'm going to start reading in verse 3. Also, a little bit of context. It's talking about Elijah, who was, I think he was a king at the time that this passage is talking about, and basically, like, there was people chasing after him. So that's why he's, like, running. And it says, then he was afraid, and he rose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, it is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers. And he lay down and he slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. And he arose and ate and drank and went on the strength of that day, or of that food, 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. Fun fact, Horeb, the Mount of God, is the mountain where Moses got the 10 Commandments. So that's why it's called the Mountain of God. So basically, one thing I want to point out is that in verse 8, when it says he was traveling on that strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights, he was going half a mile per hour from Beersheba to Mount Horeb. And that, like in that time, 40 days and 40 nights, yeah, that's like half a mile per hour, which if you like run or like know anything, like that's very, very slow. He was basically like crawling, like inching his way along. And the other thing I want to point out is that the Lord provided exactly what Elijah needed, and exactly like what Elijah needed to get through that day. And like what Elijah wanted God to just fix it all, or he just wanted to give up. And I think we feel like that a lot of the time. Like we want like God to just like miraculously fix everything, or we just want to like straight up just give up on God entirely. But God knew that neither of those options was what Elijah needed. What Elijah needed was food and a nap. I don't know if that's what y'all need, but sometimes I need that. But basically, like, God gives us exactly the amount of strength and the amount of, like, everything that we might need to get through each day of our lives and to get through everything that he has for each day. And so, like, all we have to do is arise and take what the Lord has freely offered us, which is exactly what we need through him. So we just need to take what he's given us for each day. And that's all Elijah needed to do. So we need the strength that God gives us, because without him, we're going to give up. And so during like all my like really hard times, like God put like certain people in my life. He put certain words in my life. He put certain verses in front of me. He put different songs in my life to like, that were like exactly what I needed that day or that time. And so like God gives us exactly what we need, even if we don't realize that that's what we need, because at the time, like I thought I needed some miraculous thing to happen. So God and also the other thing I want to point out about this scripture is that like God sees us when we're struggling. He was there with Elijah. He was there while he was traveling at like a snail's pace. So God meets us where we are in our spiritual, emotional, physical, like everything that we need. Hold on, stand by. I gotta fix the papers. So I'm going to read verses 9 through 15 now. So there he came to a cave and lodged in it, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And he said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind, stand by. Oh yeah, but the Lord was not in the wind, and after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and even I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria." So, like, Elijah needed to go anoint this person. And if he had given up before, like, he wouldn't be able to do that. But the main thing I want to point out in that part of this passage is there's a lot to unpack in this part of the passage, but I'm just going to focus on, like, one thing for tonight. But basically, Like, God was not in the big gust of wind. He was not in the big fire. He was not in the earthquake. He was in the low whisper. And, like, that mountain was, like, the mountain of mountaintop experiences. Like, that's where Moses got the 10 Commandments. So I think Elijah, part of the reason why he was traveling there was because he wanted that mountaintop experience with God. He wanted this miraculous thing to happen to him. But God, almost in a funny way, he kind of taunted him with, like, miraculous things. And then he was like, no, like, I'm talking to you in a whisper. And that's kind of funny to me, to be honest. But basically, like, God, he speaks to us in whispers. And he doesn't always speak to us through mountaintop experiences, through a miraculous encounter with him. He speaks to us through, like, the small things. Hold on. And so, like, oftentimes, like, we try to seek God by seeking mountaintops, when really we should be seeking him for who he is. Kind of like I said earlier, like, we need to seek him for who he is and not for ourselves. And, like, he will speak to us when we seek him, but he's not always going to speak to us in the way that we expect him to. Because when we might expect, like, oh, I'm going on this mission trip, like, I'm going to have this huge encounter with God. While sometimes that does happen, we can't expect that to be the only way we have encounters with God. So I would encourage you guys going forward to seek God in small moments, praying out loud, reading scripture, try to understand and seek him in it and not just your own desires for your life, and he will speak to you. And then I have, like, a final passage. I don't know if I'll read it or not because I don't know if I have time. Do I have time? Okay, I'll read it. But it's just a psalm, and I just really like this psalm, just because I feel like it's kind of a testament to a lot of people's testimonies. And it's Psalm 116. I don't have it up on the slides because I didn't really expect to read it, but that's okay. So it's Psalm 116. So it says, I love the Lord because he has heard my voice and my pleas for mercy. Because he inclined his ear to me, therefore I will call on him as long as I live. The snares of death encompassed me, the pangs of Sheol laid hold on me. I suffered distress and anguish. Then I called on the name of the Lord. O Lord, I pray, deliver my soul. Gracious is the Lord and righteous. Our God is merciful. The Lord preserves the simple. When I was brought low, he saved me. Return, O my soul, to your rest, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with you. For you have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. I believed, even when I spoke, I am greatly afflicted. And I said in my alarm, all mankind are liars. What shall I render to the Lord for all his benefits to me? I will lift up the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. O Lord, I am your servant. I am your servant, the son of your maidservant. You have loosed my bonds. I will offer to you the sacrifice of thanksgiving and call on the name of the Lord. I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people, in the courts of the house of the Lord. In your midst, O Jerusalem, praise the Lord. And that is my story.